This is House Planning Help episode 113. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that might get in our way. My personal goal is still to create an energy efficient home before I turn 40 this coming August. In this session, I'm chatting to self-builders Tara Murphy and Dimitri Daras. Their house, The Cut, even featured on an episode of Building the Dream, hosted by architect Charlie Luxton, who happens to be their architect as well. I wonder if that's how they got on the show. And today we're going to zoom in on budgets. How did they do? What did they learn? What advice would they give you if you're just starting out thinking of how am I going to form this budget? How much money do I really have? We'll get to that in a moment. I wanted to thank Adam Vaughan from the website Tracing Green because he forwarded on this article. It's a RIBA article, Royal Institute of British Architects, on self-build. Let's read a couple of paragraphs of it. I'll put the link in the show notes too. Despite years of championing by successive housing ministers, self-build activity has yet to show any signs of picking up and making an impact on housing delivery. The latest figures from construction analyst Barber ABI show that just under 18,000 self-build planning applications were made in 2015, the second lowest figure for 8 years. Only the previous year was lower. Of course, why? Why? We've pondered this many times, haven't we, on the podcast? So I'm not exactly surprised by this article. And that's why I've changed the direction of the podcast a bit to try and break down some of these barriers. I imagine a lot of them is just either your circumstances get the better of you. For example, there was a time when I thought I can't afford this financially, or I mentioned in the first podcast of this year that my wife and I are thinking of having another child, and that would be, it's a shame. I really wanted to move from this house into the finished self-build house. However, there might be another stepping stone in between that could slow everything down. And I also questioned from last week's episode, we chatted to Phil Skill, lovely guy. He told us all about how the councils should be taking us into consideration and at least putting forward some plots that we could have as self-builders. I'm not so sure that's happening in my area. I could be wrong. I know I need to dig further. And I just feel that it's everything is weighted in favour of the developers. Don't worry, I'm not getting back on that high horse again and going into that conversation. The one thing I did want to say all about this is, if you could email me if you're someone who has decided self-build is not for you. I'd just love to know why. What happened in this? Maybe you just enjoy listening to this podcast, or you're thinking it's a dream one day to self-build. What is that barrier? What is stopping you? Is it money? Is it finding land? Is it something completely different? So if that is you, you've gone in there, or you know someone that's given up, it would just be really useful. Our own research almost into what is stopping people. I'm sure the grand scheme of things, people want to build their own house, and it will work out if we can get through these roadblocks. So we'll also link up to that RIBA article. And once again, thank you, Adam, for sending that in. You can check his website out as well. Very good. Tracing Green. We'll put that in the show notes as well. Let's get to our featured interview with Tara and Dimitri. They've been really kind, sharing how they put the budget together, what they've learnt, some of the challenges. Could they stick to it? So we'll get to that after I ask them this simple question to get us underway: how their project came about.
We had moved west out of London, and we were in a rental property. We'd sold our London flat a while ago. And so I sort of said the time was right to start looking for a house. And Dimitri insisted that we weren't going to look at a house, we were going to look for a plot instead.
We had looked at houses before moving out west, and it wasn't great. We weren't very impressed with what you could buy, just what you get for your money, and just the quality of the houses. And it was a faintly depressing experience anyway, so that kind of informed us of our decision to think about building.
We're going to focus on budgets, sticking to budgets, what you've learned about budgets today. So from that outset, did you know how much you had, what that pot of money was?
Yeah, we set a figure to start with. So that we had some savings from selling our flat. So we came up with, we plucked a number out of the air. We said we don't really want to spend over this amount, which I think was about 350,000, including buying the land. And but as the build went on, we had to increase that amount
Okay, breaking up the budget then, you were on scouting duty. Were you able to go anywhere for this land, and what was your budget for land?
Well, I think having moved area was probably advantageous because we had no ties to anywhere in particular. So we were based in South Gloucestershire at the time. So I did widen the search over 3 counties. I looked in Somerset, Wiltshire and Gloucestershire. I knew that Somerset and Wiltshire were more likely, they were cheaper land prices. Gloucestershire, I knew was expensive for land, but I'd sort of also realised that in the Stroud area, if we were going to find anything in Gloucestershire, it was going to be around the Stroud area. So we spent a year looking. We signed up on all sorts of auction websites. I was looking at properties that perhaps needed demolishing and clearing a site first. I was looking at anything that was at rock bottom price, as well as trying to find just plots. So it took, a long time just going and seeing and getting a feel for what was out there. So we looked all over really, and there was a few nearlies. We put in offers. Unfortunately, they went with developers because they knew that they'd come in and be gone quite quickly. So that was depressing. And also, whenever you looked at a plot, you knew that a developer could come in and outbid you because they would try and put 2 units on the same plot, whereas you wanted a garden and things like that. So it was hard. And actually, it was the very end of that year that we found this plot finally. And I had pretty much given up and said, it's very unlikely we're going to find anything.
And did you put in what you were expecting for land? You had to go to that top range?
Yes, pretty much. I think we could have stretched a little bit further, or we're thinking we could have gone 10, 15,000 more. We were umming and ahhing about that one. That really was the limit.
Well, you see, this is tricky, isn't it? Because you can play your budget any way you like, really, but once you've committed that money in, then it's going to reduce off the house. So how did you get this sense of this is enough land, this is right, or was it, perhaps it's back to you, Tara, it's just that this is the one that you were led to?
It was difficult because we were essentially looking around the 150 mark, and that was a very tricky figure because you could find plots about 80 or 90, and they would tend to be end of an estate, things like that, which wasn't necessarily where we wanted to be. And if you went up to 250, there seemed to be, whether or not it's always that the grass is greener, there's always plots in budget ranges that aren't yours. So we had sort of said 150 would be ideal because that would leave us with about 200 to do the build, which we felt was a reasonable amount. So every time we looked at anything above 150, we knew that was going to have an impact on what we'd be able to build. So occasionally I'd want to really look at a 200 and I'd be cautioned heavily against even considering even going to look at it, because it really, to try and build for 150 was really too unrealistic. So this was on for 175 and we put in an offer, I think, of 155 originally, but in the end we went to 160.
2.5.
It's a weird thing because I've put in 2 offers so far on land and buildings that I thought that I'd want to buy, and one was completely blind, so you've no chance on that one. We lost out by a long way. But how did you feel you were in actually putting in those bids?
I think it was fine. I don't think there were any other people bidding. I don't think there was much interest. I don't know why.
Crazy.
Because the people who came to see it subsequently were saying, well, Charlie, the architect, said if he'd seen it, he'd have bought it, snapped it up. So I don't really know why there was so little interest. So I don't think we'd have done anything differently.
I don't think we got an absolute bargain. I think we paid a fair price. But we had really, over that year, got a good sense of what plots were worth. And so we were delighted that within our budget, we had a plot that had amazing views, and we would have a proper garden and a proper sized house. We'd also have, room to park our car and things like that. Because I had written off, when you first put down what your criteria of what the ideal plot will offer you, by the end of the year, I'd said, well, we can scratch off a good view. We can scratch off a big garden, we might get a bit of a garden. And so this plot offered us that. But obviously it was steeply sloping. So we knew that there was a reason why this plot couldn't command as much as a flat plot would.
Was that worrying to you, or were you going into this a little bit blindly?
Naively, it wasn't particularly worrying to us at all. But it had been partially excavated already, so there was a flat surface on which a previously designed house, which had been accepted for planning, that was going to be built. So the ground had been prepared for that already, so we figured it would be fine.
Once you had this plot, what were the next steps?
The next steps were to arrange the mortgage. So we discussed it with the mortgage broker from Build Store and went through all the figures, and he was pushing us to try basically to apply for as much as we can, because he was very useful. He obviously has experience and knows that things come in more expensive than you hope. So we worked out a figure with him, and then it was a case of getting a design. So it seemed rather cockeyed to us that we had to come up with a design from an architect. So we had to basically pay an architect before we even owned the land in order to get the mortgage, because the mortgage company wouldn't lend on no plans at all.
It's a really frustrating process. Really frustrating, even within the self-build market, which you would think would accept it. If you don't have the plans for the house you're going to build, they won't lend you the money, which you can sort of see that. However, that means that before you can buy the land, so we couldn't get a mortgage until we had the drawings done. So we had to go through architect selection and the first stages of the design process before we could submit our application for a mortgage. So
and before you knew that you were going to get the mortgage.
Absolutely. So it was quite a risky point in time, because we had laid out up to £20,000 and we didn't yet own the plots. And in the UK system, the vendor could have walked away at any point and we would have just lost all that money. There was no security whatsoever. So that was very, very frustrating, and the mortgage application process just took forever. And we had started, we put the offer in June or July on the land. I think it was July. And the mortgage happened and we purchased the land in January. So it took that long.
Well done for getting it through.
I know, but we're just really lucky that our vendor held out. He could have walked away.
Is there anything you could have done differently? Or this is just what you had to do to go down? You needed the mortgage?
Yeah, the only other thing we could have gone to do is approached another company for sort of a bridging loan. But who knows where that would have led us. No, so it's set up, the whole system, even within the self-build mortgage industry, seems to be set up for developers. You have to have a big, big pillar of cash in order to get this process started. If you're just like us, instead of buying a normal house, you just want to have a go at building a house, it's not helpful.
Dimitri, when you came to selecting the architect, what process did you go through in choosing various different architecks?
I think that's more of a question for Tara. But
this is interesting.
We checked the REBA sites, because that's what everyone says. First of all, go to REBA and they'll give you a list of architects in your area. I can't remember whether you can specify whether you want contemporary style builds or whether there are any kind of selection criteria. And Tara went about phoning them.
Just before we launch in on this, I'm intrigued as to how because we all have to do this as a couple. So what was your role within this and what was Tara's role?
We didn't formally assign roles at all. It was just obvious. It was it was obvious that Tara was going to have to do most of it because I was working full time. Although Tara's obviously working full time with small children, but she quite quickly decided she didn't want to have anything to do with the finance, or in fact the utilities as well, sorting out the services. I did all of that at the start, but other than that, she did most of the work. And, you know, she'd talk to me about stuff and we'd talk about things together. But once the build progressed, she had so much knowledge of what was going on that I couldn't answer questions to other people as easily as she could, obviously, because she had the knowledge. So it became difficult for me to take on stuff that she had been working on.
Well, that sounds like a glowing report there. In terms of getting your architect then, you'd gone to Reba, you'd started down that route. Where did we go then?
So I looked at local architects, and I just would look at their website, and I'd have a look at their portfolios and the photographs just to see. We knew that we wanted something contemporary. We'd always known we wanted something contemporary. So I wanted to see, and I was surprised because, you know, if you watch Grand Designs, you think that everyone's doing, all architects want to do modern buildings, but actually the majority of architects don't do contemporary. They do renovations and they do, you know, period things. So it was just about seeing some work that I liked. We'd also said that we would like to go down passive house type ideas. We were worried about that because we knew that it would cost more, and obviously our budget was small and we didn't have millions of pounds to throw around. So I wanted to talk to people that were knowledgeable about that and get some ideas from them about where they thought we could be. So eventually I got it down to a short list of 4, and then it would come down to conversations about design. And we talked to Charlie before this process had happened in the previous year when we had looked at another plot, and I'd had a good conversation with him. And when I chatted with him again, because he was obviously on the short list, he had said something which I thought was actually, looking back, really, really key. And he said, whoever you choose, and it might not be me, you need to make sure that you can be honest and you can have robust conversations and you can talk about things, because there's a lot on the line. It's very emotional, and he's absolutely right. And we needed to just go with who our instinct told us we would be able to be honest with and find our way through the series of compromises that any building project presents. And you need to be able to say honestly and not worry about things, you know, that robust sort of conversations need to happen. Yeah, so eventually we came down to Charlie. We liked his design work, we liked his style, we liked his enthusiasm. We loved the fact that he was very interested in the passive house principles, was interested in working with them. And we also were quite keen on the fact that because of his TV work, he has visited so many sites, and with that must bring a great deal of extra knowledge, because with every architect, you're only as good as how many builds you've done. So being on site in so many places, you know, we thought that would only benefit us. And we really needed those extra bits because our budget was so small and tight that we really needed to make sure that we maximised our opportunities.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment. Can you take me through that process of how you got to this finished design for the cut?
First of all, we came up with a design brief. So Tara and I discussed what we wanted and eventually agreed on a form of words, and we sent it off to Charlie. He visited the site with us, had a good look around and took photos, and then we didn't really hear any more about it until he emailed us some designs. So and from that point on, there was more dialogue. So he came up with these initial designs, which the final design didn't change that much from his original sketches.
So when you're looking at numbers, do you know straight off it's been costed, or do elements of the design have to change to fit your budget?
No, not really. I think Charlie worked on he guessed a figure per square metre and did the designs based on that. There were certain changes that he made or things he took into account in order to reduce the cost. So, for instance, having a flat roof. The roof changed shape several times. It was initially butterfly roof and then mono pitched, and anyway, so he settled on flat roof partially because it was the cheapest thing to do. Also, the window designs for the main living room, that went through several changes, because initially we wanted to be able to throw it open, the whole thing open to the elements, and Charlie eventually said, no, you can't do that, it's going to cost too much. But I think those are the only things really that were affected by the budget.
We changed internally bits and pieces, but that was more aesthetic, I think. I mean, Charlie came up with this very simple form because, again, we had a small budget, and this was a way of maximising our internal volume by keeping a very simple shape.
I think the internal fittings were dictated by budget. So the kitchen and we have lots of ply woodwork around the house. That was dictated by budgets.
There were things like I had originally said I'd like to use local materials, which of course around here is Cotswold stone, and that was immediately said no, due to their cost and the cost. Now I know about building Cotswold stone walls. I realised, yes, that was absolutely right. We couldn't afford to do Cotswold stone walls. So
you came up against these barriers very early on because it just made sense. You were putting the money into the fabric.
Yeah.
And then maybe my question then should be more about how have you achieved some of these great parts of design? You know, what of Charlie's design has really made this building what it is?
Oh, I mean, lots of things. So, you know, our flooring is the slab. We power floated the slab and sanded it down, and we all hoped. I mean, we had it in the plans that if it didn't work, we could put some flooring down on top of it. But you know, it worked, so that was great. So that saved us a whole heap of money. Our window boards, you know, we've stripped out. We've got quite a minimal look because we've stripped out lots of extra stuff, architraving and skirting, things like extra jobs on site have not been here.
Also, initially, as part of the design process, costings were done on whether we'd use concrete block or whether we go to a timber frame company to knock together the house. And that was all done with a budget in mind. So he was trying to work out what difference it made to the costs. And also, he designed the structure in conjunction with Andrew, the builder, because it's quite an unusual design. There's no cavity. It's just a single layer of blockwork, and then fins, basically, I-beam fins external to the blockwork, which then holds they provide some structure and hold insulation, that sort of thing. So he designed that with Andrew, and this was all as part of the costing exercise as well. They wanted to decide how they could build it and compare it to a timber frame model.
And as you went through this and the building started to come about, where were the stages that cost changed?
So we had quite an unconventional approach. We didn't have your standard, you know, when you look through the magazines and the books, what the standard things to do, and you then have your spec drawings and you go out to tender and then you have to change everything. Because we'd identified and asked Andrew to be involved quite early. Andrew was involved with Charlie, so there were meetings beforehand where they designed the build together. So we already knew Andrew was... So then once those drawings were done, Andrew then basically roughly costed that. So at that point we didn't change because all we were doing was comparing if Andrew were to do the masonry, skin and all of that work, how did that compare cost-wise to a timber frame building? And so it came out more advantageous for us to go down the masonry route. So that's the route we went. So the cost there didn't change. And the fabric of the house came in on budget as expected. That threw up no real surprises. Where we had the complete nightmare was that we'd actually only set aside 15,000 for our groundworks. And our groundworks was considerably more, or was it only 5,000?
I think it started off as 5 because some groundworks prep had already been done. So I think we initially set, I can't remember, the initial budget was about 5, which is crazy. And Charlie quite quickly thought it was going to go up.
What happened? Maybe you can describe what those groundworks are and how the money started to sink into the ground.
The bit that had been excavated, what we were doing was we were pulling it back into the bank more. So we had to pull out more of the bank. We had to cut back into the hill even further. So as we began to do that, we came across the fact that this is an old quarry site, historically, a long time ago, and we came into huge chunks of rock, basically. And so then those had to be pulled out, and once we started interfering with those, it destabilised the bank. And so there was propping and all sorts of things had to go on in order to ensure people's safety. So the cost just escalated quite rapidly. And it took a little longer. We'd had initially a ground worker on site who had come in with a big digger and moved things around, but it wasn't quite enough. And so Andrew and Paul, our builders, had to basically get on with it. That was one part of the build which was a struggle, getting ground workers, finding ground workers, getting them to come out, getting them to give prices. They were like hen's teeth. We couldn't get any. We couldn't find them. So that was a bit of a struggle. And so it ended up being what it was. The utilities had come in as well, much higher than anticipated. Although some things like gas, so cheap, it was not funny. I mean, I think we paid £600 for our gas connection, which was not very expensive. But our electricity connection had to come in from a lower road and come in on these giant cables and things like that. So, yeah, the groundworks budget went over. And I think in the end, is it about £40,000 over where we had expected to be.
So what did this mean then when you'd gone that much over? Was it just a case of getting out another mortgage? Was it a case of reducing something inside? I don't know.
Well, we initially had plans for a carport and kind of garage area. So that got scrapped quite quickly, along with the solar panels which were going to sit on top. But after that, it was, yes, we had to apply for extra mortgage.
We talked about considering changing things, but ultimately we dismissed that quite quickly because there would be more fees, more design fees. We would have to go back to planning. There were so many other costs associated that it didn't make sense to change anything really in the design. And it wasn't the house that was proving to be out, the budget being pushed out. It was the groundworks. So we sort of pursued first that if we could get some more money from the mortgage company, then everything would be okay. And so we did. We applied for more money and we did get that money.
There wasn't that much that we could have changed in the house design anyway. There weren't any, marquee items that were costing us a fortune. The internal design was quite simple. There wasn't, I still don't really know where we could have reduced the costs. Once we had the initial design and the kind of passive principle and got started on that, we toyed with not doing some of the internal woodwork, but we ended up doing that fairly cheap. I think some bits still aren't finished, but we had to complete certain parts of that, which we did. So there was not many places where we could reduce costs, I think.
How stressful was this whole process?
I think it was doable. It was busy. It was incredibly busy, but I was lucky that Ren, my youngest, was a baby. So she could just get strapped on my back and come on site. I didn't have, the older boys were at school.
No toddlers.
No, exactly. I didn't have toddlers. And actually, once you got toddlers, then life does become much more challenging. But I don't know, we just hit the time right. It was busy. I'm not going to say it wasn't busy, but it was fine and it was doable because actually I was at home, Andrew was on site, he was getting on with stuff. We were in telephone communication constantly, and I would, put the baby down for a nap and then hit the phones for an hour or two, trying to source things and all the rest of it. So it was fine. I think actually it was more difficult once we moved in, because then you're juggling family and the build in the same space, and that was almost more difficult. It was easier because we didn't live on site. We stayed in our rental, and that was a decision we'd made early on to not maximise this outgoings on the site, but hold a bit back, and if that meant the house was a bit smaller, that meant the house was a bit smaller, so that we could continue to rent for the period of the build. We really didn't want to be on site with a young family. So I think that would have been more difficult, because then you can't walk away from it.
Let's round off then on a couple of things. First of all, budgets. What have you learnt? What advice would you have for someone who's going into this?
I would say work out what is fundamental, what's non-negotiable, and it costs what it costs you. My philosophy was it costs what it costs. Not to worry too much about going over budget, because these are just estimates and they're often wrong. So not to get too stressed about it.
I think with budgets, I mean, it was helpful for me, Andrew, when we spreadsheeted it, because Andrew really was the one that was involved with the budgets and allocating. He had sort of said, okay, so I think you'll spend 5k on your 3 bathrooms, or I think, so if he gave me a budget, then I just did the very best that I could within that budget. Now, we had a lovely culture going on between the team, with Charlie and Andrew and me, well, especially Andrew and me, where we would, be saying, I saved us £600 today, or I did this, so that when the things that you couldn't save money came along, you felt like, okay, well, it swings and roundabouts, it's okay, and there were things that I would say, like the flooring. When we looked at the planks we have, we wanted to go with the wider plank, and so we calculated it, and it was going to cost £200-300 more. That's £200 very well spent, because you're not going to take up that floor again. But then there's other places where you can save money. So there's a brilliant thing in our bathroom where I've used just galvanised steel, which is actually my capping on my roof. And I've used that to line the window by the shower. And that was £20. So there is always, and that's the beauty of doing a project like this. You can't take the easy option. It is harder, but that brings its own creativity. And sometimes, and most of the time, the results have been really great and really satisfying. And you've been involved, and you know the story of it. It's funny now because it's a year or so on, and so now I can relax, and I'm very happy about the choices. But it was funny when you first moved in, because you knew the story and every single phone call that went into every single bit. It was hard to separate, but actually with time, that has the pain. It's like childbirth. The painful things have drifted away, and the pleasures remain. So, but no, it's been a great exercise in creativity, and we were really lucky. Our team, Andrew, Charlie, and I all really enjoyed. We had a good relationship. We had, and that doesn't always mean nice, but we were able to talk and joke and push each other to come up with the right solution in the end. And it was good. So budgets, they are estimates. Dimitri was very good. He was very philosophical about it. It costs what it costs. My only advice would be just get lots of quotes for things. Always get a number of quotes. And I think if I did things again, I would be more on top of contractors about making sure that at the end of the week, they're telling me how many hours they've accrued, what sort of costs we're at, because there's nothing worse than them being on site, getting on with it as if everything's okay. And then a few months later or a month later, when they finally put in their invoice, oh, look, it's doubled what you estimated it to be. And it's too late then. And then that's when you go to war. And we chose not to do that. We chose to pay anyway. But sometimes that leaves a bitter taste in the mouth. So I think, if I did it again, I'd be much more on top of saying, this is the limit. If you go over that limit, then that's your responsibility if you haven't informed me before then.
Finally, what do you think of your finished home, and how's it been?
I think it's great. There are no obvious changes that I would make, I think. Nothing springs to mind. Eventually, it will probably be a bit small for us as the kids grow up, and we'll see what we do then. House version 2, maybe.
That's effusive praise from Dimitri. No, it's brilliant. It's a pleasure to live in. The light is great. We're pretty smug about our heating, about how warm we are, and about, the kids are in T-shirts in the winter. We have to convince them that it's cold outside. They have no idea. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure, and it's a joy to live in. It really is. We don't want to go out as much as we used to. We used to be in a dark cottage, and we would often go outside, and we're not doing that anymore because it's just such a pleasure to be here and to be so comfortable. So no, it's absolutely great. I'm very proud of it. When I drive in, I feel very proud of it. I think it's beautiful. I would like to get the garden, the landscape done, but best things come to those who wait. Just because you've built your own house doesn't mean you get everything that you want straight away, and that will take time. It's just things like, building the carport, and we've got some more land, we've got some more groundwork to do. And you just think, are we ever going to be able to have the 15,000 or the 20, where's that 15 or 20,000 pounds going to come from? But slowly and surely we'll get there. So no, it's been great. Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed hearing some of this story. I'm sure we could have gone into even more detail, but I really appreciate it. Tara and Dimitri, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session, houseplanninghelp.com/113. You can review the key points, take a look at some photos of their gorgeous contemporary home. And I know that we've been talking about budgets, but when you spend your budget well, and on the things that matter. Look at this. It's a great house to go and check out in the show notes. And if you have a comment or you want to ask a question, please do that at the bottom of the show notes, houseplanninghelp.com/113. One thing I didn't mention was Tara's blog. We'll link to that as well. Just before I finish up, let's do a hub update. And the latest module is on finance. So we're trying to address the core issues, almost continuing on the theme for today. Typical approaches that you might fund a project, also looking at how self-build mortgages work, when you're going to get that money, or perhaps you've got some assets. What should you do? Should you sell them? Is there any bridging finance? How does that work? Is it going to be too expensive? Cash flow, the works. We've tried to feed it into this module in the hub. There's also another episode of the Long Barrow Passive House Build. This is a video you can go and watch. It's about 5 or 6 minutes long. And we go through a different stage. We're at the point of the raft foundation, pouring the concrete, and you can find out why there's so much steel in that foundation as well. And then there's the community side of the hub. You can network with fellow self-builders. We've got a closed Facebook group, which we've worked out is the best way to do it. Just nice and casual. And when you've got that time to, and a lot of people are on Facebook anyway, so it just makes sense. The price is crazy. It's crazy. £45 a year. It will go up at some point. Get in now. It's a lock-in price as well when you go in. £45 for the year. houseplanninghelp.com/hub. Next time, energy advisor David Olivier is my guest. My friend Mike Coe, who lives in the autonomous house, calls him a genius. And he has an annoying habit, apparently, of always being right. We'll see if that's true. Tons of experience. We'll get his best advice for creating an energy efficient home. I hope you can join me then. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media. Content that matters.